Hello and welcome to the Photonics Imaging Laboratory here in Allentown, Pennsylvania. We're happy to have you with us today. Each month we're going to be going through some new tips and tricks videos to help you get the most out of your SkyScan micro CT instrument. Let's go ahead and jump into this month's tip.
Hello and welcome to this month's edition of the Photonics Tip of the Month series. Today we're going to be talking about filtering within CT analysis, and more specifically we're going to be discussing the Gaussian filter, which is one of the more commonly used filters in all of image processing, and that includes CT Analyzer looking at micro CT datasets. So I've already loaded a dataset of sand granules here into this window, and this is a high-speed acquisition. So we see there's a fair amount of noise, and we can see noise in between the granules out here on the edges of the image and in between where we see these white flecks, and also somewhat the heterogeneity of the granules themselves is also a product of the noise, as we would expect these to be a little bit more homogeneous in many of these cases. So in this type of situation, it might be appropriate to use a filter prior to analyzing the data set. And I can discuss why a little bit more briefly here. If I move over to my binary selection tab, I can see that if I were to try to select just the granules themselves, I might set a range of somewhere around 50 to capture the particles. And by comparing to our original grayscale image, we see that that's capturing the granules pretty well without enlarging them too much. But we're also picking up a lot of the specular noise that we see between the granules as well. So, how can we avoid that? Of course, we could do some despeckling and other types of morphological operations to remove that noise, but maybe it would be better to just filter the data prior to beginning our work in custom processing. So let's go ahead and move to custom processing. The dataset will load into custom processing, and then we can go ahead and explore our available plugins. So in this case, we're going to be looking at the filtering plugin. Of course, there are several filters available, but today we're only going to be discussing the Gaussian filter. In future videos, we will cover the other filters in equivalent detail. So there's a couple different settings for setting up how we're going to apply our filter. One, do we want to apply our filter in 2D or 3D space? Now, 2D space will only be looking at pixels around a central pixel that's going to be operated upon and making those judgments in a 2D planar view. If we go to 3D, instead, we'll be able to look at voxels. So we'll be looking above and below the current slices, the number of radius steps away from the central pixel that we're looking at. For the purposes of this study, let's go ahead and stick with 2D, and that is important because that allows us to use the preview button, which is new, introduced in CT Analyzer version 1.20. And again, we have previously covered this in other videos, but it's really helpful to be able to preview what we are doing. So let's go ahead and keep going through the other filtering options. Next one will be a kernel, and you can choose always between a square and a round kernel. And so a square kernel is going to be sampling every pixel. Again, we're in 2D, so we're talking about pixels, not voxels. We'll be sampling every pixel on all sides, including the corners, that touches the pixel that we're going to be filtering. And so that will give us the most coverage. If you move to a round kernel, we'll be looking more towards just the immediate pixels in a circular fashion around that. So it'll be sampling less pixels around each pixel to be filtered. So again, this is going to be dependent on your work, which one you want to choose, but square kernel will always be sampling more adjacent voxels or pixels, in this case pixels because we're in 2D, or the round filter will sample less, which may be useful if you have a really noisy data set and you want to just look right immediately around the sample. For this, we're going to go ahead and stick to square. Because I want to sample as much area as possible because this is overall pretty clean data set. And finally, we can set the radius. And so this is the number of pixels in 2D or voxels in 3D that you want the program to be looking away from the voxel or pixel that's going to be filtered. And so For a Gaussian, it's important to note that this value is actually equivalent to n equals 3 and other filters. So if I were to do a median filter, the equivalent would be a radius of 3 for a Gaussian of 1. But it's just important to keep note that you have a much larger effect with radius, a 3 times effect in radius for the Gaussian compared to all the other filters within CTAnalyzer. So let's go ahead and see what happens if we preview this on this current slice, and we see that when we apply the filter, we see a lot less prevalent noise. And this also comes with the softening of the sample. So if I undo, you can see it's pretty sharp. We do a preview and it gets a little bit more blurry, especially on the edges. So Gaussian filtering is not particularly great at edge preservation, but it is a really useful and commonly utilized filter for data processing. So if you're really looking at something that's on the edge of your particles or a really defined edge, you probably want to explore a different filter than Gaussian filter, because there are other filters within CTAnalyzer which are better at edge preservation, which have other trade-offs. Also, you'll notice that we go from a pretty sharp image to a slightly hazier image. And so this is why a Gaussian filter is also known as a Gaussian blur, because we do blur the data set to some extent. However, you might be thinking, whoa, I really don't want to blur my data set. That might make my analysis less reliable. Well, in fact, at times, the blurring can actually be useful. By removing the specular noise, then you can get a better segmentation and a more accurate representation of your data set in your analyzed results than if you had not filtered it. So that was a filter radius of 1 in 2D. If we move up to 2, which is equivalent to 6 in other filters, we see that it looks like we're starting to over-smooth the data set. If we go to a factor of 3, we see that we're really over-smoothing the data set. We're starting to lose things like these pores. Of course, we've removed nearly all of the specular noise, especially in between the granules, but we've also lost a lot of the detail of our samples. Of course, maybe this is okay for your analysis, but if you do have fine details, you may want to stick with a value of, 1 or 2. In this case, I think I'm going to pick a value of 1. Because it does a pretty good job of keeping a lot of my detail, but it loses a lot of the specular noise. So I'm going to go ahead and click the plus sign or the play sign to apply this to the data set. We'll let that run. And then when that is completed, we can check and see what effect that had on our threshold. So if I go to my thresholding tab, we were using a value of 50 previously. So if I click preview, now we see that we are grabbing just the granules and we are no longer grabbing any of the specular noise that was there before. So in this way, we've cleaned up the data set before we ever started our segmentation process for analysis. And this is just one efficient way to avoid having to do several steps later, such as morphological opening and closing, despeckling, and other operations. You can take care of a lot of things with just some simple image filtering right up front. Now, of course, do keep in mind if you're doing a comparative study, you want to make sure you are using the same filtering settings for each sample in your study, because it does alter the data set, as we saw from the blurring that comes from the Gaussian filter. So if you are doing a comparative study, be sure you are applying the same filter under the same operation conditions. So the same 2D versus 3D, square versus round, and radius for all samples, and you should be able to still do a direct comparison. Thanks for tuning in this month, and we look forward to you stopping by for the next installment of our Tip of the Month series.
Hello. Thank you for watching this installment of our video Tip of the Month. At Microphotonics, we strongly believe that the research you do changes the world, and we're happy to support you in your efforts through these videos, through our advanced training courses, and our annual workshops. Through these efforts, we strive to make sure that you are getting the most from your Bruker Micro CT machine. If you have any questions on this video or any other questions, feel free to give us a call or send us an email. Thank you again, and have a good day.